Hello, and welcome to Moving Iron Podcast. I've got Alan Hoskins back on here for his monthly check-in, and Alan and I were always recording a podcast before podcast. I swear, every time we come on here, Alan, I should just hit record from when we say hi to each other, and then just let it go from there because a lot of good stuff coming there. But we brought up the idea of going through the process of what things look like and how these subscriptions and technology stuff are all playing in there. But before we get that, at least got to have enough manners here to ask you how you doing, Alan. So how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing well, Casey. Appreciate the opportunity to be on again.
Yeah, no, love having you on here because this is something I've been thinking about for a while, and I've been trying to get my head wrapped around on who owns what and how, as a lender, especially when you're looking at liens and all the legal stuff that goes in there to make sure that you guys are protected if something were to go astray. When you start looking at the broad-based spectrum of farm equipment, and the one thing that's out there right now that it is the third rail of anything. It's like talking about Medicare, man. I'll tell you, these people start talking about subscriptions and how these things work, and we're starting to see this with See and Spray on the deer side, and I think other manufacturers are going to fall right into this. This is not something that's just going to be blind to one color, but I think this is going to be something that we're going to see a lot more of. And we see this the subscription based model on the See and Spray thing, where there's you buy the componentry to get See and Spray on the sprayer, and then you've got an per acre charge that comes out there when you're looking at that, Alan, and you got to have one to make the other one work, right? So you can't just go out and use it and then not, you got it. There's multiple facets come into that. And I get from a manufacturer perspective what they're trying to do. They're trying to say, hey, this thing is wicked expensive. If we were to put it out there, it'd be whatever. It'd be whatever dollars more to have it to pay for the whole thing. As we look at going out there now, so we're going to break it out there, but I think the easiest way to look at it is if you look at it from, I buy a computer, it's got Microsoft Office in it, and I'm going to pay a subscription for, Excel, whatever. And there's a licensing fee that comes with that, and I can use that. Every month I pay the licensing fee, or yearly I pay the licensing fee, or whatever. But I also can go out and buy Excel and actually download it to my computer, and I own that. Now, I'm not getting any updates. I'm not getting any of the latest, coolest, greatest things ever, because I have to go through the whole process of doing that. But that being said, I can still go out and buy Excel. On the deer side, on the See and Spray side, you're getting the componentry, and then you pay a per acre basis. Now, you don't have to use that. You can use it on a per acre. If you do 1 pass, 2 pass, 3 pass, 4 passes, whatever it is that you're doing, every time you use it, you're going to get a per acre charge. But like I said, in order for the See and Spray to be good, from a lender's perspective, you got to have that subscription that you can turn on and turn off, but there again, it's a per acre charge. So I guess, how do you think about that, Alan, when you're looking at that from a lender's perspective?
Well, I think first of all, if you look at the initial part of the relationship where you have a producer looking at purchasing a sprayer that has the See and Spray technology, one of the things that, as a lender that I want to do a better job in understanding is how they are viewing the See and Spray and where do they feel the break-even point is on the See and Spray. Obviously, every year is going to be different, and you're going to have years where weed pressure is a little greater if they're using See and Spray. How are they determining where the break-even cost is on that? And how many acres on a general year do they feel that will be needed in order to see a revenue benefit from the utilization of the technology, from the fact that they're reducing chemical expense?
Right. Yep.
I think, we could probably have a whole conversation somewhere down the road about the environmental impact of if we get to the point where we have to talk about exactly what is sprayed on what acre, how will See and Spray help a farmer accomplish that?
Yep.
Again, I think we could have a whole program about that. But what I would like to hear him talk about is where's the break-even point of the See and Spray? Now, if I'm also looking at it from a lending perspective, you look at the price of a new sprayer. And if we're lending money against that sprayer, and yes, you have the components that have to go into the sprayer as it's built to allow the technology to be effectively utilized. What do I know as a lender about that unit? What do I understand about how the unit may be affected by the inclusion or exclusion of the See and Spray technology? And what effect might that have on a resale basis in the event that as a lender, the bank ended up needing to sell that piece of equipment due to default?
Right.
I think, Casey, that's something that candidly, when I started in banking 40 years ago, obviously those kind of thoughts never crossed your mind because
Right.
you were financing iron.
Right.
You look at what we're financing today, you look at planters, you look at combines, you look at sprayers, you look at tractors. I don't know what the number is as a percentage of MSRP or selling price, but the technology is a huge component in
Oh,
that.
for sure. Yeah.
And as a lender, and I'm just speaking for me personally right now, not the industry, I view it as a huge part of my job to understand what that technology is, what the value of it is, and more importantly, as I'm having discussions with a customer, how am I providing value to them as a lender in understanding that and being able to engage in conversations where I can be a resource to them, not a detriment because I don't understand what they're doing.
Yeah. And that's a good point you bring up there, because the technology side is, we're not to the point now where you have to have the technology to make the machine work. That's not true. You can absolutely go out and plant your corn without turning on any kind of guidance and do it the old fashioned way with markers and hope for the best, right? Don't worry about simulation, don't worry about anything. You can just go out and plant just like you would always, right? Combines, you don't need to have the various technologies that are inside combines to go out and thrash corn or wheat or whatever it is that you're doing, right? Does it all the same. Where the technology comes into play is that, just like what you just said, is that it is such a big part of the price of the machine. How do you separate those? How do you separate those two pieces from each other and then determine, all right, well, we're gonna finance the iron at X, we're gonna finance the technology at Y. How far do you think we're away from that in your mind as a banker when you start thinking about that? Because we're not that far. Because you start looking at the bolt-on technology and autonomous vehicles, because I really believe when autonomous vehicles get here and we're just looking at a tractor just to be the power unit, and it's the technology that's behind the tractor that makes a difference. The technology in the planter, the technology in the harvesting equipment or whatever it is, and the tractor's just an old school, hey, we're just looking for power right now, and it's the dumbest thing out there because it just needs to have something to make it go straight and let you know where it's at. And sense of that, there's going to come a time when the financing of the technology side of it is going to be like it was when you started 40 years ago, where it was 95% of the value, right? Was the iron. Well, it's going to flip to where 95% of the value of the unit is going to be the technology associated with whatever it is. Have you given that much thought to where you're thinking about, like, are you going to have two notes now, like the iron note and the technology note?
I don't know, Casey, that, and certainly I've not spent as much time as I would like to say I have thinking about this. I don't know that we'll get to the point of seeing two notes. What I do think, from the lending perspective, that's going to have to be given a lot of consideration going forward. As a lender, historically, when a piece of equipment is traded for and a lender provides the loan for it, the security agreement says we're doing a loan on equipment. And the accompanying document that's filed typically at the state perfecting the lien says equipment. What happens at some point when perhaps the technology or the software, depending upon who owns it, does the producer own it? Does the company, Deere, continue to own it? And the producer's doing nothing more than leasing it. How do I assist a customer in acquiring that technology, help them understand what they're really pledging as collateral, and also looking at it from the lending perspective, make sure that we're fulfilling the responsibility we have to be prudent lenders and understanding what the risk is?
Right.
I think that's the challenge, Casey, going forward, because I'm not sure how many years we are away from there being a new line on the Schedule F that may say technology fee. Because
Oh well.
if
Yeah.
we get
Yeah.
to a point where it's a per pass charge for guidance, for example, because we've
Mhm.
all grown accustomed to that, and it would be very difficult to go back without it. We
Oh
could, but
sure. Yeah.
it'd be a challenge.
It'd be hard. Yeah. Yeah.
But I have to reasonably believe, looking 5 to 10 years down the road, especially as operations continue to grow and technology becomes to be, I won't necessarily say embedded, but I will say a required part of the expense side of a producer's profit and loss statement. I think understanding what the total charge is for technology each year is going to be very, very important to understanding overall profitability.
Yeah.
And again, using the illustration you gave, I think understanding what type of collateral, because is a fee that is charged to utilize software. How does a bank or any lending institution, not just a bank, but any lender, look at what is it that is truly comprising the collateral for the loan?
Hmm.
What happens in the event of a default? And how would it be transitioned to the next user in the event of an overall default? And also, forgetting the default side for a moment, looking at the value of collateral as a part of financing operating lines. Equipment has historically been a very integral part of the overall collateral pool when a lending institution provides a line of credit. As technology continues to change what the value of equipment may or may not be, that goes back to my earlier point, Casey, where I, as a lender, feel that I need to really make sure that I understand that well enough to be able to have those conversations with customers so that at some point in the future, there isn't something that comes up because I didn't do my job as a
Right.
lender and didn't do a good job of having those conversations with customers.
Right. Okay. So here's a scenario I'll throw at you, and this would be kind of similar to what we're talking about,
Mhm.
and it's a real world example. So you have a business startup, and I got everything going. I'm coming to you and say, Alan, you know what? I need to borrow some money. I need to get a new business system, right?
Mhm.
And for them to come implement the business system, it's whatever, $150,000 or whatever for them to come implement the business system, put all the software in,
Mhm.
transfer all my data over. Excuse me. Transfer all my data over and bring all that stuff back into fruition. And then here we go. And then here's what it costs me every month or year, or whatever it is, for support
Mhm.
and leasing, basically getting a license to have this business system with this many users.
Mhm.
How do you look at that from a lender?
I want to give you two answers to that question
All
because
right.
there's two entirely different scenarios that I could use.
Okay.
If I roll back time 40 years, you were financing software that was running on an extremely expensive mainframe computer. And that software, a lot of times, was very unique
Right.
to a particular business.
Sure.
And it was of little to no value without that huge mainframe computer that, in those days, they built the buildings to where they could get air underneath the floors to keep the computers cool because they took up the size of a room.
Right.
That would be one level of discussion. But going back to what you said earlier in this conversation, it's vastly different today. If you look at the fact that for the most part, so much of the hardware that we utilize today is throwaway, it's a
True.
completely different discussion
Right.
when you're looking at software that is going to be utilized on items that basically can be discarded. I think that's one of the things that makes the discussion we're having about agriculture so challenging. You use the case of a new sprayer. The value of the hardware, the old mainframe, if you will, that's in the form
Hmm.
of that new 412 sprayer, 612 sprayer, that sprayer is still a hugely expensive part of the transaction. Should autonomous vehicles get to the point where the hardware, if you will, becomes, I don't want to say completely negligible, but certainly less than what we're looking at today,
Right.
then I think that's a whole different discussion. So I think if you have the conversation, Casey, that you're talking about, if we're looking at a traditional business in town, or even if you're looking at a farm and you're looking at software that they're going to run to operate their farm from an accounting perspective, things like that, they're doing it on throwaway equipment most of the time. I think that's what makes this discussion that we're having today so interesting to me, is because you're talking about software that's integral to the profitability of the operation, but it's still being used on extremely expensive equipment that goes along with that.
That is a true statement. Yeah. No, I think that's a good point, because if you look at today, even though there's servers out there and businesses have their own servers and they're the size of a microwave now, that's a server, pretty much. If you look at what those look like, and how the things work, they're only supported for so long, and then you have to update your server, right? Because of requirements of the software or whatever it is that you're doing, memory or whatever it is that you got in there. So all those things make a big difference. But you're right. I mean, my vision of the future when you're looking at equipment is not necessarily it's that. It's what you just talked about. It's where the hardware, the sprayer or the whatever, is only good as long as it's updatable to the next greatest technology. And there comes a point where that's hit a point in time where that technology is no longer, you can't update it anymore, and the what it can operate on is no longer supported. And that's when you start running into some real issues with what's going on with machinery. So it's this next couple of years, 24, 25, 26 are going to be, I kind of think, that gateway into that, whatever the new future is going to look like. And I think that's going to be a very unique path, because guys like you, your business model is going to change on how that is. And if you're not staying ahead of that curve, and everybody's business model is going to change, dealers' business models, the farmers' business models, bankers' business models, captive lending people, all those different things are all going to have just the way they're looking at stuff is going to change in such a dramatic fashion. It's going to be hard to know where you're at, what you're doing. And if you're not, I just, you see some of the stuff that's going on now in lending when it comes to just what we see right now, and how, in my opinion, how backward it is at some institutions that are out there. When it really changes again, the next evolution, man, it's going to be even that much more of a hot spot to watch things happen.
And Casey, going back to something you said earlier, you look at the businesses and you talked about the servers. One of the things, and believe me, I am not an IT person, not even close.
You and me both.
But I think one of the terms that I've heard utilized is the redundancy of servers.
Sure.
With what we're looking at in agriculture, there's not going to be the redundancy of sprayers or planters. Yes, an operation might have two, but it's not because one's going to be a spare or a backup.
Right.
So I think that's another fundamental change. Now, I'll also say this, Casey. I think the technological change from a personal perspective is something that I look at as a great opportunity, because innovative thinking is typically the creation of value to the end user.
100%. Yeah.
And if I'm going to provide value, I have to think from an innovative perspective of how may I create something different for my customer that is not being created elsewhere. And that goes back to making sure that I understand what goes on in the marketplace. And I think there's some lenders out there that do that extremely well.
Sure.
So I think there's some positives, but certainly we're going to have to think differently in order to serve folks even better.
Okay. All right. So with all that being said, that was fun. I love those conversations because it makes you think about stuff you don't normally think about. But when you're looking at the when you look at 24 right now, so I've had this conversation several times where, usually have a conversation about the next year, you kind of get a kind of a similar storyline, oh, it's going to be this or it's going to be that. And there's just a few different characters in the mix, but no one's storyline is really the same this year coming into 24. And they have a million different characters in their story. So I guess, Alan, as you look at 24, are you on the pessimistic side, the optimistic side, somewhere in the middle? Kind of what's your thought going into 24?
What I'm seeing right now going into 2024, I believe, based upon the things that I have seen personally, from the financial perspective, most of the folks of whom I have firsthand knowledge are going to be moving into the next crop year in a pretty good position. There definitely have been some pockets where there was some drought, but if I look at the area in which we're located, there's some folks that have had some pretty darn good yields, did a pretty nice job of doing some marketing, and they're coming into this year in a pretty good position. And I think if you look at kind of what we've seen thus far with fertilizer prices, chemical prices, that type of thing, it looks to me like, Casey, going into it, we are in a pretty nice position. We continue to see in our area some really interesting land sales. We've seen a couple lately that were definitely affected by 1031 money that has come into the area.
Yeah.
I will also say some of the solar projects, we've seen a couple of those that I think those can be potentially the revenue from those maybe affecting some land prices as well. But definitely the 1031 money is having an impact. So I think that's something to be mindful of. We still aren't seeing just a tremendous amount of land come on the market, but when there is land, there is a demand. So as a whole, I feel pretty good about where we are coming into 2024. I think folks have done a pretty good job of managing working capital. I think they're looking realistically at purchases that truly are perhaps more need than want. I've not had a lot of discussion with folks that are saying, I want to trade. There's some that are looking for some equipment that candidly, it makes economic sense, at least for the ones I've talked to
Sure.
look at it. So I did have a conversation, had a producer the other day that made a comment to me going into year end because we were talking about tax planning. And he said, my preference is to look at seed, fertilizer, and chemical versus equipment because it's not a multi-year commitment that I have to keep funding. But as I go into it, I want to make sure that I'm using prepaids as much as possible before I look at using equipment as a tax planning strategy. And for this particular producer, that comment made a whole lot of sense.
Yeah. So you brought up a good point there. I think that's one thing I'm seeing as well too, is where more people are taking a look at because it used to be, I mean, back when I worked in the dealership, you'd come back in and it would be, I'd talk to my accountant, I need to spend 50 grand. What do you got? And what do you want? And we just kind of start running down the list of the stuff that were out there. Then you start looking at, as input prices got to be a little more expensive and you started seeing a bigger dollar value around the cost per acre and those kind of things coming into play. You're seeing more and more looking at, okay, I'm going to go ahead and prepay my seed, prepay my chemicals, blah, 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 blah. And then when that's all done, I'll take a look at what I need for my equipment roll, because most of the folks, it feels like to me, more producers right now are really starting to pigeonhole themselves, and I use that term in the best possible way you can use it, pigeonhole themselves into, I'm going to run this machine for this many seasons before I get a new one. I'm going to do, I'm going to buy new one. I'm going to go on and try to figure out to get on a 1 year roll cycle and see what that looks like. I'm going to do every 2 years I'm getting a new combine, new to me combine,
Mhm.
and every 3 years I'm getting a new to me tractor or something like that, whatever it is.
Mhm.
I'm going to update my planter technology when there's something new to update it to, not necessarily because I've got a ton of acres on it or something like that, right? Because it feels like to me that the acres conversation on a planter,
Mhm.
I'm not saying it's out of the
Mhm.
window by any means, but it's so much now. Like it's got 50,000 acres on it, or 100,000, whatever it is. I'll just put no row units on it, and I got to worry about the bar. That's kind of the feel that I'm getting from that now. So I think you're right. I mean, when you're looking at what where this tax planning feel comes into, it's not like it used to be where equipment was the first thing on the list. It's not the last thing on the list, but it's not the top. It's somewhere in the middle. And I think they want to make sure that they're booking what they need to make sure they need to book right away, and then we'll take a look at what we got fleet wise in there. That I agree with what you're saying there, because that's the same vibe that I'm getting from when I listen to people talk.
And Casey, one of the things I've found kind of interesting so far this fall that I've not really had a lot of people bring up is rental agreements.
Okay.
And of course, with folks that are on a semi-annual basis on cash rent, or perhaps paying their cash rent in the fall, or even on some crop share, I've not heard a lot of discussions that have occurred yet. And we were talking earlier about the utilization of technology.
Yep.
I think, Casey, that's the utilization of technology can be one of the best tools I think a producer can use in showing value to a landlord.
Yeah.
And whether that's in the form of potentially talking to them about a tile project or another type drainage project based upon yield maps. I think there's a great way that technology can be used to help build that landlord relationship. But at this point, I've not talked to a lot of people that have had a lot of discussions with landlords and where that trend may be. I will tell you that I participated in a couple of training opportunities within the past month where there was a discussion, at least in one of those, about a significant number of landlords that were moving toward possibly looking at all rent being paid up front in order to minimize their risk. And Casey, that's in today's world, we're looking at interest rates that are certainly higher than where they were 2 years ago. If that would become a trend, that can have a fairly significant impact on a producer's expense. So I think that's something to kind of bear in mind a little bit as we see where that might head.
So explain that a little. Are you thinking about from the longer term interest that they have to pay on that? If they were to say if they didn't write a check for that, they had a line of credit or whatever, that now they're going to carry that cash rent for 12 months instead of 3 months?
Exactly.
Okay.
In fact, I had a producer, in Casey, this was about a year and a half ago. I had a discussion with a producer, and he said that he had seen his cash rent payments. Historically, they had been semi-annual, where he would pay half in, say, February or March, and then he would pay the balance in November or December. He had seen a significant change in the timing of those to where they were now required to be paid in February. So if say your cash rent to a landlord's $100,000 a year, and now you're required to pay that 100,000 in February instead of, say, 50 in February or March and 50 in the fall. If you're utilizing an operating line, obviously you're tacking another perhaps 9-10 months of interest expense on that 50%.
Wow. Yeah.
Even if you're using your own cash, there's some pretty good rates of return available right now in some CDs.
Sure.
So even if you're using your own cash, you're seeing a diminishing of your rate of return on your interest. So that's a trend I'm kind of interested in seeing. And I've heard that mentioned now. One was an attorney that talked about that. And in the other case, it was a trend more in a farm management company and how they were handling things.
Yep. So I'll add one more thing to that. The producer can keep that technology and the maps and yield maps and all those kind of things and soil samples and all those kind of things and show back to the landlord, hey, this is what I'm doing for you. This is what I'm. Flip side of that too is now your landlord, they should be asking for that same, you know, the same technology readouts that they're getting there, the same, you know, what's that look like, and start building that base now where they can go start looking at this stuff. Cause you know, there's no like book out there that says, hey, if you're farming in this county, this is how many dollars an acre you should be getting for your piece of ground, right? It's really just arbitrary. Like, I'm just going to charge you X because this is what I've always done. And there's some good companies out there that kind of embrace that, kind of look at it. But at the same time, all that being said, you know, there's a lot of technology out there, a lot of information, a lot of data that's getting poured in that stuff. And it's everybody should have that in their arsenal when they start having that conversation. So very important stuff.
They should. They should. And Casey, to me, the data in and of itself is not the value. It's the knowledge of what the data means that truly creates the value.
Yep.
And that's where if I'm a producer and I'm sitting down with a landlord, I want to make sure they understand the data and how I'm using it for their benefit.
Yeah.
Because providing data just for the sake of providing data, most of the time, candidly, will harm the relationship.
Right.
It's only when there is an explanation of how it is of value to, in this case, the landlord, and how that producer is doing something differently for them than others in the marketplace may be, that it truly becomes a value to both parties.
For sure.
And I think that's what you look for. How do you create the win-win?
Yeah, exactly.
For both parties.
Yep. And that's where that data does that for you. It really does. If you share the data and you're open about what it is, then everybody wins, right? Okay. All right, Alan, good place to stop. Man, we covered a lot of ground on that one. You are I'm gonna get this right this time. Okay, you ready? You're the president and national sales director for see, I already messed it up, man. American Farm Mortgage. God bless America.
See, Casey, now you're doing that to the point where I get to say it. I know what it is.
Oh man, one of these days, Alan, I'll get that right out of my mouth. Okay. If folks want to reach out to you and get in touch with you and just pick your brain about stuff, Alan, what's the best way to do that?
Sure. My email address is ahoskins@americanfarmmortgage.com. Casey, I'll also give folks my cell phone number. It's 618-926-0463. Candidly, I like phone conversations a lot better than I like emails. If I'm candid, I'm kind of old school in that respect. And plus, it's always great to talk to people. And most importantly, it's always great to listen to people and learn from them.
Right on, man. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to come on and talk about this stuff. I always enjoy having you on. Hope to see you next month.
Absolutely. Appreciate it, Casey. Thank you.
I'll talk to you. Have a Merry Christmas.
Same to you. Merry Christmas to you as well, Casey. Thank you.
All right, man. I'm Casey Seymour with Moving Iron Podcast. Check me out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Moving Iron LLC. Go to LinkedIn at Moving Iron Podcast, Twitter or TikTok at Moving Iron Podcast, Snapchat at Moving Iron Podcast, and the video version of this is on the YouTube channel, which is at Moving Iron Podcast. Now, it's shocking, so just blew some minds there. So check it out there. Go to movingironllc.com for everything Moving Iron related. Hope to have a new website up here by the first year and have some over the next couple of weeks, have some big announcements about what's going on with the Moving Iron LLC and Moving Iron Podcast for that. So with that, I'm Casey Seymour with Alan Hoskins. Let's move some iron, folks.